So if Dr. Fifi, you will introduce our speaker.
Yeah, so I'm very happy and honored this morning to present our speaker. She's a role model for many of us. Dr. Melina Kibbe, she's a professor of surgery with tenure and the Colin G. Thomas Junior Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of North Carolina. She's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering. Prior to UNC, Dr. Kibbe was faculty at Northwestern University for 13 years, where she also served as the Vice Chair of Research in the Department of Surgery and as Deputy Director of the Simpson Curie Institute for Bionanotechnology. Clinically, Dr. Kibbe has significant experience with both open and endovascular surgery. Her research interests focus on developing novel therapies for patients with vascular disease and simultaneously studying the mechanism of how these therapies impact the vascular wall. Her bibliography and authorships include over 300 peer-reviewed manuscripts, review articles, and book chapters. She has authored and co-authored over 230 national and internationally presented abstracts. Her research has been funded by the NIH, VA, Department of Defense, American Heart Association, among others, and she has received an award in recognition of her research from President Obama in 2009. She has assumed multiple national positions of leadership. She's currently the editor-in-chief of JAMA Surgery. She's the past president of the Association of Academic Surgery, the Midwestern Vascular Surgery Society, and the Association of VA Surgeons. She's also an active member in the American College of Surgeons, the American Surgical Association, the Society of Vascular Surgery, and the American Heart Association, among other societies. She was inducted into the American Society of Clinical Investigation and most notably the National Academy of Medicine. We're so happy to have you here today with us and hear about the role of advocacy in research and impacting change. Dr. Kibbe, the screen is yours. Looking forward.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Fifi. That was incredibly way too generous. But thank you so very much. I am really excited to be able to talk to all of you today, but I'm also super sad that I'm not there in person. I really was looking forward to visiting you because this is an invitation that came over a year ago, and I really did want to visit you all in person. So today with the talk, I'm going to be talking about the role of advocacy in research and impacting change. And as it pertains to the material in this talk, I have no pertinent financial disclosures, but I will tell you, I do want to disclose just a few things. So first off, I am a very dear friend of Dr. Lillian Cow, who is on this call, and another reason why it would have been great to actually be there in person. And you might ask, for example, how does a vascular surgeon who at the time was in Chicago become a good friend with an acute care surgeon who's been in Texas? And it really goes to show that in academics and through the networking of being engaged and involved in your national societies, you can really develop lasting friendships. And Lillian and I have worked together in various roles for many years through the Association for Academic Surgery. And it's been a lot of fun to be able to do this with her. So much so, she's had some crazy ideas and has done some crazy things with me. One was that I probably will never forget is when she convinced us all to actually climb a mountain in Malaysia. Yeah, not going to do that again, but we both actually did summit. And you can see how much she's enjoying going down because it's pretty painful after you go up. And then I will also say that it was a great honor when Dr. Cow was the president-elect and she was able to present to me one of the gifts from the AAS. And I love this gift and I just had to share with you. This is in my house, hanging up on the wall, but I just couldn't not show you all. Dr. Lillian Cow is R2D2. It is one of the most adorable things ever. So there you go. I also want to share that I do have some other connections. Now, I did not see Dr. Teddy Pusio and Dr. Mike Wandling connected, so maybe they connected in the last minute, but they both were residents, Mike at Northwestern when I was there, and Teddy here from UNC. So I'm super happy that they're actually both working with Dr. Cow and very happy that they're with you guys there at UT Houston. All right, so advocacy. So I really want to tell you my experience and this story that you're going to see of advocating really for something that one can be quite passionate about. So when you look at advocacy, so the actual definition is the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal. So let me start by telling you a little bit about Vanessa Young. So Vanessa Young was a 15-year-old girl from Canada. And one day she was talking to her father, and they were in their study of their house. And she turned around and was going to go upstairs, and she dropped dead at 15 years of age. And this was a horrible, horrible, tragic event. And really, there was no pre-existing condition as to why they thought that she could have dropped dead suddenly. However, it was then found out and determined that she was taking a medication that I know many on this call, including Dr. Safi, remember well. So Propulsid. So Propulsid or Cisapride, and I'm sure Dr. Cow remembers this too, we were given this out like candy in the 90s. And this was a medication used for, various different GI upset, promotility, you name it. So as a 15-year-old girl, she was taking Propulsid. And what we then learned afterwards is that Propulsid actually can cause torsades. And this is what she died from. And this has led to a lifelong pursuit by her father, Terrence Young, death by prescription, as you can see in this particular book. But what did we learn from Vanessa's death? So two important things came out of this. So one is we realized that we did not, at that time when she died, and this was in the 90s, did not have good reporting system for adverse drug reactions. And then the other thing is it came known that Propulsid has greater adverse reactions in women. So if you look at this list, basically all of these drugs on the top have a greater risk, health risk in women, and Propulsid was on this list. So it then gets to the question of why are medications associated with a greater risk, greater health risk in women? Why? And I'm going to tell you more information about this. So drugs, and I'm going to, by the end of this talk, hopefully convince you with the data that drugs are simply not being developed and equally tested in both sexes. And this is a problem. So there are many sex-based differences. We know as physicians that men and women can manifest diseases differently. They can experience illnesses differently. They can respond to drugs differently. They can also metabolize drugs differently, respond to devices differently. I mean, think about hip replacements, for example, the differences between males and females, or even, what I do in aneurysms. There are clearly different sizes between males and females. And then males and females can have different outcomes following both medical and surgical therapies. So here's a list of common diseases with sex and gender differences. And when I get to this part, I always want to remind everyone that when I'm referring to sex, I'm referring to our chromosomal differences. And that's what most of this talk is about. I'm not referring to gender or phenotype by which we portray ourselves. Now, I'm a vascular surgeon. So where do I fit on this list? And for all of us down here, so all cardiac and vascular surgeons, heart disease, right? So we have some known sex and gender differences. Let me just take a little bit of a deeper dive and show you a few slides. Here's a common slide from the American Heart Association. This is the 2020 update. I think most all of you have an appreciation that when you're looking at cardiovascular disease, it's higher in males compared to females. I think we all have that general appreciation, and it increases as we age. However, did you realize that more women die from the disease than men, even though there's a higher prevalence in men? Most people don't realize this is a huge sex difference. Now, looking at some of the drugs, just again, in my own space, so if you look at aspirin, aspirin is more beneficial for men than women. And in fact, as we know, for regular risk, it's actually recommended for males, but actually it's a contraindication for females. And that's a big difference. It was a super common drug. Statins, more beneficial for men for primary prevention, but a greater risk of adverse reactions in women. If you're looking at angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, they cause more adverse effects in women. Digoxin, increased mortality in women. And warfarin, women usually require lower doses than men. And these are just the drugs in my space. So now I would have you all think about the drugs that you're prescribing in your own specialties. So it leads us to this question. Why are men and women given the same drug for a disease? And then why are men and women given the same dose of a drug, especially after what I just showed you about all those different drugs? So can any of you think of drugs that are dosed differently based on sex? Now, usually someone might throw out testosterone, okay, but I'm talking about non-sex-based drugs here. So think about it. Is there any drug that any of you can think of that you prescribe differently based on sex, male versus female? I think you would be hard-pressed to come up with a drug. Well, we really have one really well-known example now. So Ambien. So Ambien is a very interesting story, and Ambien is what helped to allow us to advocate for this issue. So what happened is Ambien is a sleep-inducing drug, and Ambien was approved way back when in the early 90s by the FDA. Same dose for both males and females. And what happened is later, more recently, is they realized that there were increasing number of reports of women who were taking Ambien and the next morning were getting into automobile accidents. So after they did a deep dive into it, they realized that women metabolize the drug more slowly than men. So it was still in their system the next day. So that led the FDA for the first time ever to do a label change based on sex. And so now women, the recommended dose is half that of men. So 10 milligrams for men, 5 milligrams for women. So I'll pose it back to you again. This is one drug. Think of all the other drugs that are out there. How many other drugs should have dose adjustment? What worries me are life-saving drugs, for example, chemotherapeutics, where there may be differences between the sexes. All right, so now you might be saying, well, how did we get to this point? What is the root of this problem? So this is the drug development pipeline that most of us are used to. So you usually, in developing a new therapy, you'll start with your basic science and examine how it works with cells in a petri dish. Then if that works, you'll go on to your animal research. And then if that works, then you'll be testing it in humans. So what I'm going to tell you is that when it comes to this issue of studying therapies in both sexes, we have had a focus back in 1993 on including women and minorities in clinical trials that are funded by the NIH, and that's known as the Revitalization Act of 1993. And again, many of the older folks on this Grand Rounds Zoom will probably remember that push in the 90s to include women and minorities in clinical trials. But I'm going to tell you, there's been absolutely zero focus on animal research and cell research when it comes to studying therapies and novel treatments in both sexes. And one of the problems with this practice is that, guess what? So the most expensive aspect of this pipeline is human research compared to animal and cell. And the other thing you may not know is that the majority of clinical trials are failed clinical trials. So I would pose that if we were better informed by conducting research in both sexes at the cell and animal level, then we would actually have better clinical trials and fewer failed studies if we were doing this in a more smart manner. Again, just my thought that I'm posing. So back when I was at Northwestern, I was part of Teresa Woodruff's Institute for Women's Health Research. And we talked about this issue. And so again, I'm a vascular surgeon, so we wanted to look at it, at least in the surgical space, to see, are we having issues with sex bias at those early parts of the pipeline in cell and animal research? So Dustin and Neil, who were two integrated vascular residents at the time, they're now done, we decided to look at this. So we looked at every single publication in these 5 kind of broad surgery journals for a 2-year period, 2011 to 12, every single article. And we abstracted all sorts of information, and then basically including the sex of the cell, sex of the animal, etc. So what did we find? So in those articles, so we had a little over 2,300 articles. After excluding the humans, we were left with 618 that looked at cells and animals. Okay, here's what we found. Now, I have to say, every time I show this data, I'm surprised, and I was surprised at the time. So just looking at the number of manuscripts that stated the sex of the animal they were researching, 22% of published, peer-reviewed published papers did not even state the sex of the animal. Now, I point that out because a ton of you are peer reviewers for journals. So please try to pay attention to this and point this out, because this should be 0 in my opinion. Now, of the papers that stated the sex of the animal that they were researching, here's the pattern. 80% of the studies were male-only experiments. 17% were female-only experiments, and then we have this tiny little 3% that studied both sexes. That is tiny, you guys. Now, when you look at cells, we had a different pattern. Look at this. 76% of the publications with cells did not even state the sex. Now, I know there's some of you who do research, and you're probably shaking your head right now going, well, I bought those cells from a company. Trust me, the sex is known, and the sex can make a difference when you're growing these cells and treating them in a petri dish. So please state your sex of your cell. Now, of the 24% that did state the sex of their cell, whoops, same pattern. 71% studying male-only cells, so cells grown from male animals, 21% female-only, 7% actually studied their therapy in both sexes. Again, a very small number. Now, so we then asked, well, what about those investigators? These are our surgical investigators, our friends. What about those folks who are studying diseases that are prevalent in females? So looking at our list, 2 that popped out, cardiovascular disease and thyroid disease. So statistically, several of us women on this Zoom have thyroid disease. And so we pulled those manuscripts, we had 45 of them. 44% did not even state the sex that they studied. And of those that did state the sex, it was even worse. 88% were studying male-only animals or cells. And these are in diseases that are prevalent in females. Then the last question we did is, after we saw this data, we then asked ourselves, well, wait a minute, now that we see this, are we getting better over time with this practice, the same or worse? So we went back and we abstracted the data for the 2 prior decades. And this is what we found. We're actually getting worse with this practice of studying male-only experiments. Again, I was not expecting to see this. Now, what are the implications of this sex-biased research in this early aspect of the pipeline? I know this is a grandiose slide with my statements here, but I'm gonna say it. So 1, drugs are developed that just may be ineffective for women. We could have drugs that are developed that may have unintended side effects. So again, I showed you Propulsid. I showed you all those other drugs in my own space that have more adverse reactions in women. So this is real. And then drugs that show no efficacy in males may be dropped and not pursued, but they actually could be efficacious in females. So to me, these are the three downstream negative effects of this practice. Now, what about human research? So I showed you the cell in the animal. Okay, so we went back, and this time we looked at all of the human articles. We had over 1,600 articles with human subjects. What did we find? Again, a little surprising. 17% of peer-reviewed manuscripts in those 5 journals did not state the sex of the human. Please don't do that in your papers. And again, if you're peer reviewing, try to catch this. Now, of those that stated the sex, there's good news. Okay, so we actually had 78% that are including males and females. So that is really, really good. But we do have this 17% that is unspecified. We then went a step further and we looked at the absolute numbers of males and females. Again, I don't know where the unspecified is going to sit. And so it could end up being even, but this was incredibly encouraging on this data for the absolute numbers. Now, I'll tell you where the problems are. The problems with human research are different than the cell and the animal. So we then looked at each individual published study, and we asked the question, how well did the authors match the inclusion of males and females? So meaning 100% match would be there's 50 males and 50 females. And a 50% match would be something like 50 males and 25 females, or vice versa. So what you can see is that when you look at this, so only 45% of the papers had at least a 50% match. That's not very good, you guys. And something like a goal of 70 or 80% match, still a very small number of manuscripts did this. So that's one. We're not actually including males and females at not even close to equal numbers. And then here's the other problem. So we looked at sex-based reporting of the data, meaning if you're looking at how therapy is working, or let's say you're looking at a novel endovascular device for aneurysms, and you report it in your population in aggregate, did you then report the data by males and females? That is sex-based reporting. So we found that only 38% of our surgical papers had sex-based reporting. Only 33% statistically analyzed the data by sex, which to me, this should be a given. And only 23% discussed the data by sex in the discussion section. So this is the big problem with our human clinical research. So much so that this was recognized by the Government Accountability Office, the GAO report in 2015. So they are recognizing that more females are being included in NIH-funded trials, because that was our Revitalization Act that addressed that. But despite the Revitalization Act, sex-based reporting and analysis of results remains an area of disparity. So you end up with this, you guys. This is kind of like my money slide, right? 80% of drugs that are removed from the market are removed because of a greater adverse reaction in women. This is what you get with this practice. The odds of an adverse drug reaction in women is 50% greater than in men, and women are more likely to be hospitalized due to adverse drug reactions. You get tons of articles like this. I could show you just hundreds of these. This was Terry Gross, Fresh Air, NPR. You get articles like this. Even the rats are facing sex bias too. Poor little rats. So how do we fix this problem? All right, so this is again my personal thoughts, is that we need to have increased awareness. And so I do think that there's 3 different areas that we need to be targeting when it comes to increasing the awareness of this, because I'm going to guess that many of you on this Grand Round Zoom or WebEx have not thought about this issue before, because why would you have? So one, I think we need to increase the awareness among the investigators themselves. I'm going to show you a video. I was guilty. I was not thinking about this issue. So I was one of those. I think we need to increase awareness among physicians who are prescribing these drugs. Most physicians also don't think about whether or not that drug has been tested equally in males and females. And then, oh my gosh, the patients. So every time I give a version of this talk to a lay audience, I get the same question or same iteration of the question at the end saying, but Dr. Kibbe, I don't understand. If my doctor prescribed that medication, I just assume it was tested in both males and females because of the implicit trust that the community has in physicians. So this is also one reason why, again, I advocate for this topic and I try to talk about this to increase awareness as much as I can. Now, one thing that we did, and here is where I learned so much from Teresa Woodruff, is that the group of us at Northwestern, I want you to know, we were by no means the only group trying to increase awareness of this issue. Many groups across the country were working on this, and the world. But Teresa was really insightful and said in order for us to move the needle on something like this, we needed to get a national platform. And so we wrote away to all the different news media outlets that you can possibly think of. And one day, no joke, the producer for Leslie Stahl answered us and actually said, Leslie thinks this is an important topic and she wants to do a story on this. So I'm going to show you a small clip of the story that aired. Right, here we go.
Early last year, the Food and Drug Administration made an unusual and surprising announcement. It cut the recommended dose of the most popular sleep drug in the country, Ambien, in half for women. It turns out men and women metabolize Ambien, known generically as Zolpidem, very differently, leaving women with more of the drug in their bodies the next morning, and therefore at a greater risk of impaired driving. Ambien, Zolpidem, is now the only prescription drug in the country with a different suggested dose for men and women. But we've discovered it is far from an isolated example of differences between the sexes we never imagined. More and more, scientists are realizing that the differences are dangerously understudied and that pervasively and fundamentally, sex matters. A few years ago, Dr. Kibbe was using her male rats to study a problem that occurs in people. She explained that after common surgical procedures like balloon angioplasty, which opens up blocked arteries, scar tissue often grows and blocks them off again.
And this is scar tissue right here?
Yes.
She discovered that a drug called nitric oxide could prevent that process in her rats.
She is one of our superstars at Northwestern, a tremendous surgeon.
Teresa Woodruff is also a professor at Northwestern Medical School and heads their Women's Health Research Institute. One day at lunch, Dr. Kibbe told her about the success she'd been having with her treatment.
I said, oh, well, that's interesting. What happens, what are the similarities or differences between males and females? And she said, oh, well, I don't study females, I only study males.
And she says, have you studied it in females? And I looked at her blank-faced, and I said, no, I'm studying it in male animals. She's like, Melina. And so she educated me.
Did she chastise you, or you ought to be ashamed of yourself?
All of the above. Yeah, and she really got me thinking.
Woodruff challenged Kibbe to go back and try her study in female animals, giving her a grant through her institute to buy the additional rats.
Up until this lunch, did you, in your own mind, assume that male and females responded the same?
I did. I was shocked at the outcome.
I still remember the real epiphany moment when she came running into my office and said, there's a 180-degree difference between males and females. You know, that's powerful because that drug doesn't work the same in males and females, most likely. And so by uncovering this out of a lunch, we can change human health. So that was a true story. Everything except for I don't recall running into her office to tell her, but
it really was a true story. She gave me money so that I could then study my therapy that I was testing in my lab in both males and females. And I was shocked because I had been working on developing nitric oxide-based therapies for a very long time, my whole career. And I had never had the wherewithal to actually ask the question, does it work the same in both sexes? So it works fabulously in male animals, and I had been testing in mice, rats, and pigs, fabulously, like 95% effective. I went to go test it in females, and it didn't work at all. I had to jack the dose way up to get a similar efficacy. So that was my light bulb moment. I couldn't believe that I hadn't thought to ask the most basic question, does it work in both sexes? So again, that's why I encourage all of you to do the same with your own research. Now, the advocacy part. So Teresa was spot on. It is amazing to see what happens when you get a national platform for something like this. So the 60 minutes segment aired, and no joke, within like a few months, the NIH announced their plans for a new policy. This was literally like 3 months after it aired. I've never seen the NIH react that fast. And this was going to be a new policy that would require investigators to report their plans for the balance of male and female cells and animals in preclinical studies. So that was great. We were so excited when we saw this. So then we literally waited a long time, waited, and Teresa was going to DC. It was really good. She was representing. So finally, we got the policy implementing rigor and transparency. So I'm sure any of you who submit NIH grants are very aware of this policy. So basically, it stated that any grant submitted to the NIH after January of 2016 must include sex as a biological variable in their experiments. And this is now a score deriving factor. So that was amazing. That was a huge policy change that we were super excited about. Now, I was sitting on study section the entire time. In fact, I just recently finally rotated off of study section. But these are some examples from grants that I was reviewing in one of our surgical study sections. So you can see right after the policy came out in 16, here's a grant that said, we will attempt to use all male mice since the incidence of aneurysm development is higher in males. All right, think about that, you guys. The investigator's actually pointing out there's a sex-based difference in aneurysms and only wants to study males. Okay, now another grant, since no known differences have been reported in graft hyperplasia by sex, we will study only males. There are so many things wrong with that statement. Of course, there are known differences in graft hyperplasia by sex. But even if there weren't any known differences, that's not a reason to only study one sex. Here's another one. In 18, we will study male pigs. No justification, nothing. So trust me, I'm sure they were not happy if they knew I was the reviewer. Male Sprague Dawley rats will be used. Same thing, no justification. So, and here's one, probably thinking it was okay to say all females would be used. Again, using all females is not the answer either. Now, Teresa did a survey, and this was just in 2019, of NIH study section members. And I think this is very telling. And it means that we still have a lot of work to do in this space. So when asking study section members, did they feel confident that they understood the sex as a biological variable policy? 88% understood it. When asked if they think it's important for NIH funded research to consider sex as a biological variable, now we dropped to only 68%. So hello, 32% don't think it's important. And then, do you think that consideration of sex as a biological variable will improve the rigor and reproducibility of the research? Only 58% thought yes, meaning 42% did not think it was important. So this to me is another area that, because if the folks that are actually reviewing the grants don't believe in the policy and the importance of making sure that we are developing and testing therapies in both sexes, to me, that's a problem. Now, journals, very clearly have a role to play here. You saw the number of manuscripts that didn't even state the sex of the human or the animal or the cell that they were researching. So I believe that all journals should require all authors to provide a description of the sex studied for all cells, animal, and human research. Just simply stating the sex. I think that should be a universal requirement. If only one sex is studied, that's fine, as long as a justification statement is included. I would like, again, all journals to require this. We're not quite there. Journals have been good. All 5 of the journals, after I published our original work, all 5 changed their instructions for authors. And many journals have now addressed this, but it's not uniform. It's not 100% yet. I'm super happy, though, that the Surgery Journal Editors Group was very proactive. So in 2018, the group met at the college and we all agreed to co-publish. These were the editors of the surgery journals, to publish this joint statement in support of including sex in all manuscripts. So I was really happy with that. Now, the FDA. Yes, I'm a little critical of the FDA because I'll tell you, I don't think they've done nearly enough. So after the 60-minute story aired, and then the NIH came out with their announcement to develop the new policy, in August, the FDA came out with this FDA action plan to enhance the collection and availability of demographic subgroup data. Okay, so this was a step in the right direction, but clearly not far enough. So then in 2016, a few years later, they came out with their Women's Health Research Roadmap with 7 different research priority goals. Look at number 1, advance the safety and efficacy and reduce the toxicity of FDA regulated products used by women. I thought that was their job, just saying. So my little critical, yes. Now, industry funded research. This is an interesting space. So currently, there's no specific mandate or policy for industry-sponsored clinical trials. That Revitalization Act was just for NIH-funded clinical trials. So basically, what industry is held to is the FDA when they're submitting new drug applications. I personally think that the same guidelines that apply to government-funded research and clinical trials should apply it to industry-sponsored clinical trials. Because guess what, you guys? 90% of clinical trials are industry funded. So I think this is another gap that needs to be addressed. The government, I also think, has a role here. So I was thrilled that after the 60-minute story aired and the NIH came out with their announcement, this congressman, actually from Tennessee, Jim Cooper, announced Research for All Act of 2015, and it has requirements for both the FDA and the NIH. It has not passed into a law, so I am worried that this is just going to completely disappear. But when people ask me what they can do, I say, write your congressman and tell them to support this. So that's one thing that folks can do. Now I'm going to end with some good and some bad news. So some good news is that we went back, and after the original publication on those articles that were published in 2011 to 12, after 5 years of having them published, we then went back and we looked at their subsequent citations. And we found something extremely interesting that I was not expecting to find. We looked at the articles that actually included sex-based reporting, and guess what? They actually received 2.8 more citations than articles that did not have sex-based reporting. Those that statistically analyzed the data by sex, 3.5-fold more citations, and those that had a sex-based discussion, 2.6 more. This was unbelievably cool, in my opinion, because it means that our scientific community is recognizing the sex-inclusive research as more impactful. So that was really good. Now, bad news, we just published this. This literally just came out in Surgery. So after 5 years had gone by, we also then decided to look, are we now better? Has the NIH policy had an impact? Are we better at performing sex-inclusive research? So we abstracted all of the exact same process, the same 5 journals, every publication from 17 to 18. And the light purple is the original data set. The dark purple is the new data set. Now, looking at the percent of articles that just simply state the sex, you can see that we got slightly more that are stating the sex of the human. We're up to 87%. But the number of articles stating the sex of the animal is about the same. And we actually dropped on the number of articles that stated the sex of the cell, only 5%. I will tell you that the N number for articles with cell research has also dropped significantly. And how did we do on the distribution of studying both sexes? So basically, if you look over here at the animals, so we did have a slight increase in the number of articles that study both male and females. The dark yellow is the new set. And we had an increase, we definitely had an increase in the number of cell studies doing both sexes, but the N number was so small it didn't reach significance. So it's not great news because we're not having a great impact on this practice yet. And then something else we recently did, so this is not published yet, but this is a small snippet of another study that we're writing up right now, is we said, all right, how are our big high impact factor journals doing with clinical trials? So we looked at, and this is just the snippet from New England Journal of Medicine, but we also looked at JAMA and Lancet. So again, being a vascular surgeon, we pulled basically the 10 most recent clinical trials in vascular surgery as one example, okay? So you can see the dates of these clinical trials when they were published, and you can see the total number of subjects enrolled. These are big trials, you guys, studying, this is in PAD, this is varicose veins, this is looking at vena cava filters, this is a follow-up on the OVER trial, okay, so aneurysms. So these are important topics that are important for both sexes. But guess what the distribution in current literature is? Here's the distribution of male to female subjects enrolled in these clinical trials in New England Journal of Medicine. The red arrows indicate all the studies that have 60% or more male subjects. And then even if you want to say, okay, what about 70% or more? We still have 5 studies that have 70% or more male subjects. So we still are not getting to the point where we're actually including males and females at equal numbers, or even close to equal numbers. So in summary, so I will tell you that sex, hopefully you understand now, sex does matter. Our research is fraught with sex bias, and this leads to many downstream consequences. And while I showed you the surgical research, it is the same for all of our specialties. This is just showing you what's in our little domain, but it's no different. So to conduct research that matters to all people, sex as a biological variable must be considered. And I do think that there's a great need for increased awareness of this topic, and there's definitely a need for policy change, further policy change. So it gets us back to advocacy, right? So I hopefully showed you in this story how advocating for a topic, you actually can have an impact and you actually can move the needle on this. So I'm going to show you, this is bringing it back to Vanessa Young, who I told you, the 15-year-old who died and dropped dead from torsades after taking Propulsid. So the good news is her father, who really advocated for this, basically was finally able to help get Vanessa's law passed. This was just passed recently in 2019, and it requires hospital staff and physicians to report serious adverse drug reactions and medical device incidences basically into Health Canada within 30 days of the incident occurring. She was a Canadian and died in Canada. So this is really good, and I was really happy to see that something was able to come from that. So I'm gonna end, and I'm gonna show you one last video clip because I truly think this is the best possible video clip that demonstrates the importance of this topic. So after the 60-minute story aired and the NIH announced their plans, it was pretty amazing. Colbert, back when he was doing the Colbert Report, picked up the story. So I'm going to show you a clip. The audio is a little low. I'm going to turn it up, but you may have to turn your audio up as well.
It's not just mindless adoration, folks. I need it. And I want to thank you for singling me out for your applause. It makes me feel special as an individual. Because frankly, I'm sick and tired of hearing about equality. Equality rights for gays, equal pay for women, equal space for equal. And now, Obama's equalocrats over at the National Institutes of Health are directing scientists to perform their experiments with both female and male animals. Co-ed lab rats? That's a bad idea. You just know late at night they're going to hook up at work, then it's going to be awkward around the water bottle the next day. You see, traditionally, folks, when scientists tested drugs on mice or rats, they were usually male. Seems natural enough. The female rats are all being used to test cosmetics. But looking good. All right. But of course, there's another reason the female rats were left out of the experiments.
Turns out female rats also have those pesky hormones.
So to control for that variable, most researchers study just males.
You got to leave the females out. Any scientist knows it's crucial to eliminate extraneous variables, like half the global population. But apparently, folks, turns out that omission created a few whoopsie daisies, like Ambien dosage. Ambien was put on the market after extensive testing 20 years ago, but just last year, the FDA told women to cut their doses in half because new studies showed they metabolize the active ingredient more slowly than men do. Unfortunately, a lot of those women didn't hear the FDA because they were asleep for some reason. And now, they're blaming the rats.
Not studying both male and female animals results in more problems for women down the road.
If the whole darn pipeline is male-dominated and sex differences truly do matter, how can it not be the case that you're going to end up with, on average, a lot more negative side effects in women than in men?
So, women should be grateful for bonus side effects. I mean, this time it's being sleepy, but next time it might be invisibility or heat vision. And this long-standing tradition of testing on only male subjects is based on the underlying assumption that females are simply a variation on a theme. Folks, that's science. Male is default human. All right? If you want bells and whistles like the bumpy bits in front or all that fancy plumbing down there, it comes at a price, ladies. For instance, we don't make medicine for you. I mean, after all, how are we supposed to? Women are too complicated. That's why they're not allowed on boats. Their gyno pieces make compasses go crazy. Don't believe me? Then why are their insides shaped exactly like the Bermuda Triangle? Lost a lot of good men in there. So, folks.
So with that, I really want to thank all of you for this invitation. I really wish I could have been there in person to be able to interact with all of you. So with that, thank you. And if we have time for questions, I'd be super happy to take questions.
Yeah, Melina, I would like to start. Thank you for this really great talk. It's every time I hear about it, it's more enlightening and kind of educational. 2 years ago, because of treating women, and especially, honestly, to tell the truth, for me in vascular, I treated a woman that had a dissection postpartum. And so kind of like talking to them and talking to women, we realized a lot of the research is not there. They didn't know what to do. So we initiated a group for Women's Vascular and Cardiac Health Initiative, where I included neurologists, cardiologists, geneticists, and we started looking into things. The more I looked into it, the more I learned how much I did not know that difference existed and disparities existed. And so in every aspect of it. And it's difficult. You try to raise awareness. And the first, as you said, the first place to raise awareness is us. We don't know how much we don't know. And even listening to you today, I've learned even more, even though the past 2 years I've been focusing a lot on that. I realize despite that, there's a lot more that we still have to learn. I think a lot of it has to do with maybe also collaborating together, multiple centers that are actually have that as their interest to kind of make it work. And I think one of the things that I have a question for you, and we're working locally, I know that we're working to actually change that. And it just happens to be that this week, Dr. Soraya was talking to me about even making a section in our Aortic Houston Symposium for women, for aortic disease in women, right? And so you can see in conferences, there are more conferences that are coming up as diseases in women, vascular diseases in women. But how about pushing it to become a permanent section in the large conferences? I mean, if we bring the audience to us, and instead of just having those conferences for the people that are interested in it, making it for everyone, then people are going to learn, because most of us just don't know that we don't know this. I mean, what's your input on that, and what can we do to kind of improve that?
Yeah, I think it's super important what you just brought up. Now, but to be clear, I'm not here saying that we need to be looking at only disease in women. I'm advocating that we look in both sexes. And I actually think that I would like to see, you know, if you use conference as an example, I would like to see at conferences that everybody is reporting their data by sex. In aggregate, super important, but also sex-based reporting. If we can just simply get to that point, that would be a huge improvement. I was really sad when we just published the data at the 5-year later look, you know, to see if there was an impact from the NIH policy. And it's sad that we haven't moved the needle hardly at all. We had a couple percentage point increase in those who reported the sex of the human, but that was it. So I think we still have a lot of work to do. And it's kind of daunting, right? To think, well, what can we do next to move the needle further? I really do hold the FDA accountable. I really do. And I don't think the FDA still has done enough. You know, if you want to see the gotcha moment in the 60 Minutes, it's with the FDA. Because basically, the question was asked, well, okay, so now that you know this about Ambien, are you going to go back and look at other drugs to see if other drugs need to be, you know, have different dosing indications? They basically said, no, we don't have the manpower. I'm sorry, this is human health. Yeah, this is human health we're talking about. We pay for them. So anyhow, don't get me started.
Dr. Cow, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, great talk, Melina. So sorry you couldn't be here. I actually remember when you first put out the review of the journal papers and lack of studying sex-based differences, and it's amazing to see how far this has all come. I apologize if this is a loaded question, especially since you are a JAMA editor, but I'm curious as to what we should do to study other variables that may have heterogeneity of treatment effect that may not be mimicked in animals, like race and ethnicity. And what should we do about that?
Yeah, super important question, not loaded. And you're right, as an editor of JAMA Surgery, that's definitely right up my alley and very important. So one thing, when it comes, it's all important. And we need to be studying and reporting not only sex, age, weight. I mean, there's so many variables. And of course, when it comes to ethnicity, ancestry, race, you name it. Of course, when we get to the issue of race, that's a much more complex issue, as that is not a biological, right? That's a societal issue. And so we need to be really careful in how we're addressing all these things. But one thing that I learned from Teresa and the group is that early on, we discussed whether or not we wanted to tackle more than just sex. And I think she's right. If we went out of the gates back in, this is 2013, if we tried to tackle everything, we never would have moved the needle at all. And one thing when it comes to advocacy that I'm now a firm believer on is you need to tackle just one thing at a time. And we figured what is the most common, as Colbert put it, sex. It's 50-50 of the population. And what disappoints me is if we can't get this one variable right, how are we going to ever get all the other variables right? That's what worries me. How are we going to do precision medicine when we can't get sex right? So it's all super important, Dr. Cal, and I love that question. And of course, there's an awful lot going on in that space right now, too, as you probably know, especially in social media.
We have one other question from the chat is, have you noticed a similar issue showing up with surgical devices rather than medications?
Oh, yes, yes. I change this talk frequently and add different examples, add and remove examples. Oh, I had a great little story in there about AICDs. And so, yes, the sex differences are there, especially in the clinical trials on devices. And so that the slide that I showed near the end, just looking at all those clinical trials, many of those are devices. And again, we're doing harm by not studying it relatively equally in both sexes. Now, mind you, many people ask me, when I say relatively, I put the word relatively equally there. I don't necessarily advocate that it has to be equal. It could reflect the prevalence of the sexes in the disease. It could reflect the population, just something that's logical and makes sense, because right now it is not logical.
Dr. Kibbe, this is Sheila Coogan. I really enjoyed your talk. Even if you publish data, how do you prevent sort of paternalism and people not following data? So my favorite example is AFib, where some sweet little lady is not anticoagulated because she might fall, and then she has, a stroke or an ischemic leg because she wasn't anticoagulated for atrial fibrillation. So even with data, how do you prevent that practice in medicine? Because I think that's pretty pervasive, even with good evidence, which would tell physicians to treat their patients differently.
Oh gosh, Dr. Coogan, that is a great question. A little different from my topic, and that is something I am also with the journal editor hat on. I'm passionate about is how do you get why? Okay, what you're basically saying is why don't more people follow evidence-based medicine? Something that Dr. Cow also talks about, right? And I actually, let's take breast, okay? Breast cancer is a great example. And I actually asked Monica Morrow to write a viewpoint on this because she's in this space. That is a space that has wonderful, clear clinical trials. And when you look at the percentage of surgeons out there in our world that are actually following the wonderful evidence-based clinical trials in breast cancer, it's small. Why? So I cannot answer that question, but I agree with you, Dr. Coogan. It is an incredibly important question. And maybe that is something that a group could take on and advocate for and figure out how we can get more physicians to adopt evidence-based guidelines. I love that you asked that.
Dr. Kibbe,
yes.
Tony Estrella, really enjoyed your talk today, very enlightening. It seems to me that one of the big problems is pharma. And so how do you what is your plan to address pharma, as most of the studies are funded by pharma and less than 10% of pharma have female or women CEOs? So it seems like that's a huge issue here and an uphill battle.
I love you guys. You're bringing up so many really good issues. You just had like 3 major issues in your comments. So, but I think, Dr. Estrella, that you raise an important point, and I clearly talked about industry. It upsets me that industry does not have the same guidelines as NIH-funded research. And so that is something that whenever I am talking about this to folks in DC, that I'm trying to emphasize, but it's hard to regulate. So that's where it comes back to FDA, right? Because the companies, they're held to the regulations of the new drug applications by the FDA. So it gets back to, I don't think the FDA is doing enough. So while the FDA does require the inclusion of males and females, they currently have no requirement on balancing the males and females by the prevalence of the disease or the population. They have nothing. So that is something else that I would love to take on. It's just an issue of time. But thank you. That's a great question. The issue of the low number of female leaders, thank you for adding that. That's a very enlightened comment, but that's like a whole different talk, and it's super important. So thank you for mentioning that.
Any other questions for our speaker?
Again, I wish I could have been there in person to visit with all of you. I really do, because I missed out on meeting with all the faculty and all of the residents as well. So thank you, though, for inviting me virtually.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Great talk. And wish again, hopefully we'll be able to get together soon in person. So thank you, everybody.
Absolutely.